There's a moment that doesn't get talked about enough. You've been in a dry spell, weeks, maybe months, and then all of a sudden you have sex. And for a little while, something in the room changes. You feel warmer towards each other and easier, more like the versions of yourself that you recognize. And you think, okay, we found our way back. And then a day passes, maybe two, and the distance is back. The same low hum of tension. The same conversations that kind of go sideways. That same feeling that something between you still isn't just quite right. And you're left standing in that, wondering, what was that? What just happened? Coming up in this video, we're going to look at why sex sometimes feels like the solution when it's actually pointing at something else entirely. I'll share some of my insights around why this happens. For example, the couples who have more sex and feel more confused, not less. The person who finally gets what they asked for and still feels like something's missing. And the question that tends to be far more useful than, how do we have more sex? So let's get started. Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, also welcome. I'm Cyndi Darnell, sex and relationship therapist who works with all kinds of people in all kinds of relationships all over the world. And this channel is where we have the conversations that many of us have in our heads, but not out loud. Here, we talk about relationships, desire, intimacy, connection, friendships, emotions, grief, and what gets in the way. If that's what you're here for, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. So let's begin with the logic behind why the belief makes so much sense. That if something feels wrong in a relationship, there's enormous relief in being able to point to a concrete thing. And sex is concrete. You can notice its absence. You can name it when it's stopped. You can count it, you can track it, and you can have a direct conversation about that. But compare that to the alternatives. We've grown apart. We don't feel emotionally safe. Something between us has shifted, and I can't quite name it. So you can see why sex becomes the focal point. Vague relational weirdness, that's harder to hold. Frequency is easier. And the logic that follows from that, that's not wrong. Sex does do something real. Biologically, it reduces cortisol, it increases oxytocin, and it softens the nervous system. And emotionally, it can create a sense of closeness, of contact that other forms of connection sometimes don't reach. So when people say, if we could just have more sex, things would be better, they're not making it up. They've probably felt that. They've probably had experiences even that confirm that. The part, however, that gets overlooked is what happens next. Because if the underlying conditions haven't changed, if there's unspoken resentment, ongoing disconnection, communication that's been fraying for months or even years, sex doesn't touch that. It creates a window, a moment of softness. And then the window closes and everything that was there before is still there, sometimes more visible than before, because the contrast is clearer. So let's look at when having more sex doesn't help. So imagine a couple who had been together for about 9 years, and they were having problems. And by the time they started to really do something about it, they realized they hadn't had any sexual contact for close to a year. And so naturally, every time they argued, the conversation would come back to this. One partner felt rejected and was quietly withdrawing. The other felt relentlessly pressured and was shutting down. And both were convinced that if they could just get the sex happening again, the relationship would stabilize. So they worked on it. They looked at what was making initiation feel so loaded. They looked at what no had come to mean for both of them. And they worked on rebuilding some physical ease, slowly. And over time, they did get there. Sex became part of their relationship again. It wasn't frictionless, and it wasn't a return to some earlier version of themselves. But it was consistent enough that sex was no longer the problem. And what came next really surprised them. Not the resolution and not the warmth they'd been waiting for. What came next was friction they'd never had to deal with directly, because for 12 months the sexual rupture had been absorbing all of it. Old arguments resurfaced, Silences that used to feel neutral started feeling pointed. And one of them realized they'd been carrying grief, genuine, non-relational grief about something outside the relationship that had never been spoken. Not because they'd been hiding it, but because there had been no space that felt safe enough to put it. So sex hadn't created that unsafety, but it also hadn't been addressing it. So when sex came back, the thing it had been accidentally masking became easier to see. So now let's look at the question of symptoms, because this is something I come back to again and again in sexuality work. Is sex the source of the problem? Or is sex where the problem is showing up? Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's both. But regardless, you always have to investigate. For example, pain in your shoulder, it might be a shoulder issue, but it might also be your neck or the way you've been sleeping or something further down the chain that the body has been compensating for. The location of the symptom and the location of the cause are not always the same place. And so relational and sexual disconnection, they work similarly. So people often describe to me what sounds like a sex problem. Low desire, mismatched libido, one partner's always initiating and the other always deflecting. And those experiences are real. I want to be very clear about that. And they're painful and they matter. And the suffering they cause, that's not in question. But underneath the focus on sex, there's often an assumption, quietly organizing everything else, that if we can just fix this part, the rest will flow. And when you're in it, that assumption is hard to question because it feels so reasonable, right? Because sex is tangible and the rest is not. Remember this. So let's look now at what you ask for in contrast with what you need, because one of the most disorienting experiences, and I see this regularly, is when someone gets exactly what they asked for and it doesn't land the way they expected. So imagine this situation. A partner starts initiating more and they make a real effort. They're attentive, they're present, they're trying, and for a short while, that really feels like progress. And then something subtle starts happening. Those initiations start feeling performed. Not because they're not trying, they are. But there's something underneath the asking that the trying, it's just not quite reaching. So when they slow it down, what comes up is something much older and much more specific. A need to feel chosen and not approached. A sensitivity to whether desire feels genuine or like an obligation. A long-standing pattern of holding back until they feel certain they are safe enough to be seen. None of that is going to dissolve because behavior changed. What they asked for was more initiation, but what they actually needed was to feel like their partner actually wanted them, not a version of them that was easier to be with. And those aren't the same thing. And sex, even more of it, can't bridge that gap on its own. So now here is a critical question that I ask a lot of folks that I work with, and I'm going to ask you too. If you're struggling with mismatched libido in your relationship, which a lot of people do, let me just say that. The question I often ask folks who are struggling with the frequency of sex is, what are you hoping that sex will make you feel? Not what are you hoping would happen? That's a different question. And not what frequency do you want? Or what would you count as improvement? They're important questions, but they're not this. What feeling are you reaching for? For some people, the honest answer is wanted. Not physically desired in an abstract way, but specifically wanted in a way that feels directed and intentional, like it's you that they are reaching for. For others, it's about closeness, not warmth so much, but more like being met. The ability to relax into contact without bracing, without managing, without some part of you waiting for it to go wrong. And for others still, it's reassurance, a way of checking whether the relationship is still intact, a kind of bodily sense of, are we okay? When words feel too charged to work. And for other people, it's something closer to aliveness, feeling something wake up inside them that's gone quiet. Not necessarily in the relationship, but in themselves. Sex can touch all of those experiences, really genuinely. And that's not wishful thinking. It has a real capacity to open those things up, but it doesn't create them reliably and it doesn't sustain them on its own. And when it doesn't, that's not random, that's information. Let's now look at what the moment after sex tells us. And someone once described to me the moment immediately after sex as the hardest part of their week. Not during, but after. They said, for a few minutes, I feel close to them, really close. And then it fades. And I'm left with how far away they feel most of the time. And somehow that's worse, because I just touched what it could be like, and now I have to return to how it actually is. And that is not a sex problem. That's contact with longing. And longing, when you pay attention to it, tends to point very clearly toward what is actually missing. The ache after the specific quality of it, that's data. It's not failure. It's not evidence that your relationship is doomed or that you've made the wrong choices. It's the nervous system being accurate about what's present and what is not. And so the question worth sitting with is, well, what is it pointing at? Now I want to pivot and have a look at what actually helps us in this situation, because I want to be careful here not to turn this into a tidy prescription, because the whole point is that what's actually needed tends to be specific to you, to your relationship, and to your particular history. But broadly, what tends to matter is turning toward what sex made visible, rather than moving past it. For some couples, that's learning how to repair after conflict, genuinely repair, not just resume normal functioning until the next rupture. For others, it's learning how to speak about what they actually need and not just what they want physically. For others, it's about emotional safety, and safety isn't something you can just declare into existence. It builds over time through small, repeated experiences of being honest, of being real, and not punishing or being punished for it. Sometimes it involves grief, the things that we hoped for that hadn't come to pass, the relationship you'd thought you'd have, a version of yourself that still feels distant. And that kind of grief doesn't belong in the category of problems to fix. It belongs in the category of things that often just deserve acknowledgement. And sometimes this is the part that can be really hard to sit with. Sometimes the absence of sex is not the problem at all. Sometimes it's the most honest thing that's happening in your relationship, a kind of embodied truth that hasn't found words yet. Sex can be playful, connective, grounding, and restorative. It can remind you of what's possible between you. All of that is real, and all of that is worth having. But when it doesn't fix what's wrong, when you have it and you still feel distance, that moment is worth pausing in rather than rushing past, because it tends to show you, with more clarity than most things, exactly where to begin. If this video was useful to you, please share it with someone who might need it. That genuinely is how this work reaches the people who are looking for it. And if you're not already subscribed, this is the kind of content I like to make week after week. I'd love to have you here. If this is landing for you and you'd like to go further, there are a few ways that we can work together. My book, Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, is a good place to start for folks who like reading. If you would like something more personal, I offer coaching and counseling online for individuals, couples, and polycules. Reach out to me via my website if you'd like to know more. But if you would like a more structured path that you can work at your own pace in your own time, I have online courses in the Intimacy Lab, also on my website, built exactly for that. Links to all of that are in the description below. As always, I love having you here. Thanks for joining me, and let me know in the comments how this conversation landed for you. What did it bring up for you? What did it make you think? And what are some of the feelings you are hoping sex will make you feel? These are really important questions, and if you feel comfortable, share them below. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.